So I said today that today is more about defining the problem of transportation justice. And I can see no better way to begin than by hearing from the world's foremost expert in the theoretical underpinnings of transportation justice and how to plan more equitable transportation systems. And I have a formal introduction to Karl that I'm going to skip because it's here. And I will instead tell you that I met Karl about a decade ago at TRB, the Transportation Research Board. And at the time, it was hosted across multiple hotels, and they had shuttle buses, much like the school bus you were on this morning, take delegates around between conferences. And I was delighted when Karl sat down next to me on the bus, because I thought I was about to have a great conversation with Karst Gers, who 3 years earlier had written a seminal paper on accessibility. About halfway through the trip, I realized that it wasn't Karst. And we had an amazing talk about Waltzer's spheres of justice and the philosophical underpinnings for how accessibility should be distributed between population groups. And at that point, these were nascent ideas. You were presenting the first draft of your conference paper that later turned into a great article, and which I believe later really served as the underpinning of your excellent book, Transport Justice, published in 2017. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Karl Martens. And
wow, too much nice words. Thank you for that, Steve. I'm very, very honored to be here. I've been working 15 years thinking about transport and justice, feeling at the beginning, I think, a little bit awkward in the academic community of taking up that topic. And now I'm so happy to be here and see that actually so many people organize around this theme, want to push it forward in academia and in practice. And actually, I think what we're doing is making the world a better place. And that's what it's all about. I think behind also theorizing. I also remember that bus ride very well, Steve. I didn't know that you thought I was Karst. I can just tell you that many people confuse the two of us, so you're really in good company. and actually, your positive interest actually strengthened me that I was on the right path, and actually some people across the ocean also thought this was an important topic. So I also want to thank the organizers for organizing snow today. This is the first time I see snow in 3 years, so that's fun too. So I don't want to repeat my book, which I've done on too many occasions. So I'm trying to give a talk which I think is essential if you want to address justice. It's about understanding transport problems better. What are transport problems? How do we perceive transport problems? What is our perspective there? And let me start with, I think, what is the traditional perspective on transport problems. And I've been bashing engineers, I think, for much of my career, and I actually only later came to realize that they are wonderful people. So some people see the light late in life, and I'm among those. Because engineers, they come from a very, very progressive tradition. A tradition that developed in the 19th century when cities were very horrible places to live in. They were terribly polluted. They didn't have proper services, and life was really, really bad. And engineers actually saw all the new technologies that were developing as opportunities to improve people's life. And so they took electricity and gas and water systems and sanitation systems, and they saw it as their duty to roll out these systems over the entire city and ultimately over the entire country and connect each and every house to that new systems. And so they did, very successfully, I must say. And transport planners and transport engineers actually developed much later their discipline after the Second World War, but they took that same ambition with them. They took up the new technology, being the car, embraced that and saw it as the new technology that would actually liberate people from the confines of space and enable them to travel around freely. And so, like the engineers of water and electricity and sanitation systems, they started developing a new road system that would enable everybody to travel around. And so this is what they want to do. Create a system that serves everybody. So was their thought. And as the engineers of water, electricity, and sanitation systems, what was the problem? The problem was if the system wouldn't function right. You don't want to have electricity blackouts like we have now in Toronto, actually stopping the metro. But we don't want to have any of these things in our system happening. A problem is when the system doesn't function. If the system functions, it serves people. If it doesn't function, it doesn't serve people. And we have failed as engineers. And so engineers started seeing engineering is failing. And this is a problem. They took the infrastructure dysfunctioning as their problem. The problem occurs when the system is not functioning well, when people cannot easily get from places. And so traffic congestion was the major problem. And I think this battery just stopped working, so we have to use this. And if they were a little bit more advanced, they would also look beyond the technology of the future, the car. They would look at the transit system and say, where there's congestion there too, people are not being served. And we have failed as engineers. And we set up a whole system of tools and data to actually analyze our transport systems and identify where future failure of the system would occur. And that would be the transport problem, and I don't have to explain you. We have whole transport modeling, and in the end of the transport modeling effort, we get out a set of links where capacity falls short of demand, and that's where our problems are. So this is the traditional perspective. If the system doesn't function, there's a transport problem, and for decades, that is what we have been doing, solving that problem. Yeah, that would be nice. So I think people that are gathered here already understand and feel, obviously, that this is not the right way to go, and this is not a proper perspective. Because what the engineers were right when they were designing electricity, water, sanitation systems, that if you would roll out those systems and you would connect everybody, you would serve everybody, they were right. A 2-year-old child can open a tap, a 3-year-old child can go to the toilet, and if they're a little bit not a dangerous seeker, they can also use electricity safely. But it doesn't work like this with the road system. It doesn't work, Steve, I understand. Yeah, it's not working. Okay. So that perspective of the system worked very well for electricity, sanitation, and electricity. People connecting each and every home would mean basically serving each and every person, and also the cost of using those services would typically be rather low. And so also income wouldn't be a barrier in most cases. Obviously it wasn't the case in transport, because in transport, for some reason, and I don't know exactly why, but I guess this is the engineering perspective, they forgot that actually we're not moving water molecules or whatever is moving electricity, I never understood. We're moving people. And not connecting each and every house to a wonderful freeway system without traffic lights and smooth travel doesn't mean serving everybody. We basically forgot 3 important population groups, and obviously one would be people without a car. Now in the 60s, in my country, in the UK, in Israel, which is my other country, my country is both Israel and the Netherlands, there were actually politicians saying for every household a car. The belief was if you give every household a car, everybody could benefit from that system. And that vision was obviously one car for the household, so it was only the man having the car and the woman. I don't know what they were supposed to do. But even that vision of having one car for each family never really materialized until today. Even in affluent countries, there's a substantial part of the population who can't afford cars. So that's one group that was forgotten, although maybe the illusion was there that everybody could afford a car. The other group of people is obviously people with impairments that for some kind of reason could not use a car. And sometimes it's just even people like us. We might be not impaired, but we might break a leg and then for 6 weeks be without the ability to drive a car. These things happen regularly, continuously. So it's not just them, it's basically us potentially being at risk of being served by only a car system. And the third group of people, it's only a small part of your life. Why would we spend time on them. They're children, youth. I mean, when I was young, at age 4 or 5, I would already walk around the neighborhood safely. At age 8, I would walk along a 4-kilometer road where cars were driving like a maniac to the forest, and it was completely normal. But basically, we have not planned for those people, and we have slowly confined them to their homes. So these groups of people were basically ignored in the engineering perspective. And so we have to get out of that perspective, that's clear. We have to move away from looking at the network, which is the engineering perspective, and we have to move towards people and look at the diversity of people. And the diversity is very essential. So there's no average person. People are very, very different in their needs and in their abilities to use various transport systems. And I would actually argue that there is no single transport system that doesn't exclude people. Public transport is not suitable for everybody, not only because many vehicles are not wheelchair accessible, but also people might have other problems that stop them from using buses because they're afraid of crowds and so forth. The bicycle is a wonderful means of transport, as I can say as a Dutch person. It also excludes people. So there is no single mode of transport that doesn't exclude people. So we should always start from people and not from transport modes. And it means something very, very important for what we should do as a transport planner. We should not measure travel behavior, which we've been obsessed with. We measure travel behavior continuously, systematically. We know everything about travel behavior, but we don't know whether that travel behavior reflects a problem or not. People go from A to B. Was it easy for them or difficult? We don't know. We hardly ever measure that. And so it's not just actually thinking about the transport problems, but with it, we have to change our whole perspective on how do we do transport planning. There's a whole system of toolboxes and rules and data that we are collecting and connecting together to define what is a transport problem, and that whole perspective has to change. Now, transport problems, then is the question, what are transport problems if it's not congestion, right? If it's not a network perspective, so what could be a proper measure be? So I proposed 3 options. And which we later today will discuss. So my lecture fits very well with the workshop. It wasn't planned at all like this. So we're on the same page. One bus ride is enough to be on the same page, apparently, with Steve. So one option is, sorry, I'm going too fast, is actually to analyze those trip patterns. So we have so many data on trips, on how people travel, how often they travel, which means of transport they travel, for what purpose they travel, what distances they travel for. So we could actually use that database to figure out who is traveling a lot and who's not traveling a lot. And that might be an indication of problems. If you don't travel a lot, maybe you do it less because the transport system is not enabling you to travel. And so I'm just giving 2 quick graphs of my colleague Karen Lucas, who tried to map the relationship between income and trip frequency. Trip frequency being an important indicator. Making less trips might be an indication of actually being prohibited from traveling. And so you see a very strong relationship between income and trip frequency, especially on the very, very low side of the income scale. So when income goes up quickly, trip frequencies do not change so much anymore. But the very low income people do travel much less. Likewise, there is a relationship between income and distances. People who have more income travel over long distances, and they do this especially for work, for business-related trips, but also for leisure. Low income means less trip distance. Now, these are nice statistics, but basically we don't know to what extent they are, of course, the result of people's choices, or maybe their opportunities. You might travel over shorter distances because everything is close by. Low-income people typically don't tend to travel far to their work because it doesn't really pay off for them, but they might still have work. Just means less kilometers, maybe they're even more happy. So it's quite difficult to interpret those trends, and so what we should entangle much more is actually looking at the people who are likely to have more problems, and to see to what extent the transportation means they have available actually enable them to do things or prevent them from doing things. And income is one means of transportation. Of course, having more money means being able to afford more travel, but that's obviously only one part of it. Access to a good transit system, access to a car is probably more important. And so Roorda with Steve here also did an early study, and now he has much more advanced stuff, trying to understand trip generation among vulnerable groups. And they distinguished 3 vulnerable groups: elderly, single parents and low-income households, and trying to figure out whether their trip frequency, the number of trips they make in a week, is actually shaped by mode availability, among others. And so it's a terribly complex modeling effort. I'm happy there are people that can do this stuff. And what I found was actually that for the elderly, if you have a car, you do make more trips. Transit doesn't do so much. There's a small increase, but it's not so strong. For single parents, transit doesn't do anything. Doesn't help them at all. The car does. And low income actually is the opposite, interesting enough. Having a car doesn't give them so much more, but being close to transit does. Now clearly there's the effect of income. Even if you have a car, you might not want to use it because it's so expensive to use, and so you avoid using it unless it's really necessary. But transit is not that expensive, and so you might use it if you need to travel. Now these already point towards some transport problems there might be, right? We might see, okay, people that travel less, make less trips, they might be the people that have transport problems, and we should address those problems. Now, I think it's not that easy to use this as an indicator for transport problems. So one is because transport problems are so much, or trip making is so much related to many other variables, right? It depends very much where you live, and it depends on your household composition, it depends on the type of job you have, it depends on the type of person you are, whether you want to make lots of trips or not. So there's many other factors going on, and I guess with some modeling you could solve those to some extent, to try to understand and entangle whether having good transport is what enables you to make trips, or having bad transport is actually what causes you to have few trips. Maybe. I would say there's still the question whether this is a matter of choice or restraint. To what extent do people who like to make lots of trips actually choose locations with good access to transit, or are willing to spend more of their income on cars? We don't know. It's not so precise to determine this. So even if we can entangle to what extent transport plays a role, we don't know whether people actually make residential choices that enable them to make more trips or less. So that's also a complicated one. And then even if you would say, okay, we can figure out for low-income people it's mostly restraint that is what limiting them. It's not making choices. You can't choose your resident if you're poor. Maybe. But then still the question is, when is less trips a problem, right? So we see less trips, but when is it a problem? Making 1 trip less a week, is that a problem? 2 trips less a week? 3? Going only once to your family rather than twice a week, is that a problem? It's not so easy and obvious what actually is a problem. Okay, they make less trips. Now, is this a problem? So just analyzing those trip patterns gives us a sense of where problems might be, but whether it's really a problem is more difficult to capture, I would say. So we have a long way to go there. So the second option is accessibility. So many of us here in the room have worked on accessibility, and actually in my book I also make an argument that accessibility is really the thing that transport should care about. Accessibility is to destinations, so your ability to get to places you want to get to, is fundamentally a measure of freedom. The more places you can get to, the more free you are to do what you want to do. The more places you can get to, the more you can decide to change your life tomorrow. You might not be interested to change your jobs, but if you have higher access to jobs, you are able to change your job. Or when you get fired, you're able to find another job more quickly. You might not want to go to a hospital, you might not have gone to a hospital for 10 years, but having access to that hospital enables you to get service when you need it. So it's fundamentally about freedom and giving direction to your life if you have high levels of accessibility. And accessibility is in a way a very good measure of it. The more places you can access, the more free you are to decide what you want to do. The more choice determines what you do, and the less restraint. And so in my book I make a very long philosophical argument for people that have stamina. They can go through that chapter. If you don't, this is just the bottom line. It's very easy. A very intuitive standard of justice, which is every person is entitled to a sufficient level of accessibility. And it says, under virtual all circumstances, I won't get into this. So basically, there is here implicitly a definition of what a transport problem is, right? The transport problem, what I find here is very simple. Insufficient accessibility. Whenever a person has insufficient accessibility, that person will have a transport problem. His choice or her choice set is limited, and we find it insufficient. I won't get into what insufficient might be. I'm just going to give an example how you can analyze this in Amsterdam, which gives a feel of the challenges. So this is Amsterdam region. There's a transport authority making long-term transport plans for this area, and I kind of did their homework in my perspective. This what I did here, they have to do themselves, they don't do it yet. And for those who have been in Amsterdam, that's on the other side of the ocean, first of all. If you remember, it's not the capital of Denmark, but of Holland. And this is where you have been, probably, if you've been there, that's where you have been. It's a wonderful place, cycling, public transport, happy people, lots of bars and pubs, and too many tourists by now. But the region is slightly bigger and it's not as great as you get out of the city center. And actually also public transport is not that great anymore. So, what I did do, I got data from engineers, thanks for that, on accessibility levels and on travel speeds. And so I tried to organize population groups living in the Amsterdam region on a scatter plot. And on the horizontal axis, there is a measure of potential mobility, the ease with which you can travel around. Not if you can get to a place, but just how fast you can get around. Doesn't matter to measure exactly now. And on the vertical axis, there is accessibility level. And I measured it in terms of the jobs you can get to, not because it's only about jobs. Jobs are also an indicator of other destinations. They go together with retail, with education, and so on. And so obviously you can understand if your speed goes up, you can more easily travel around, your accessibility goes up. You should keep me on time. And so this is the connection you would see, right? Higher speeds means you can reach a larger area, which means you can reach more destinations. Now, what does it look like in Amsterdam? So in Amsterdam there are 190 zones for which I have data on their speed to all the areas around, also beyond the region, and all destinations, all jobs in 30 minutes and even beyond. And so you get this graph. I don't know if people can see it in the back. So there's 190 zones, and they are here depicted 3 times. Once for people who own a car and their situation in off-peak hours. Once for those same people during peak hours. And for public transport, I only have the data for peak hours. So people without a car, what do they get from the transport system? Assuming they can only use public transport. I didn't have data on cycling at that moment. And so you can feel who is where, right? I can't use the squares and there are triangles here. So this is a situation of people with cars in off-peak hours. Very high accessibility, and obviously because the speed is much higher on the network. Their accessibility drops quite substantially in peak hours to a lower level, about half of what they have in off-peak hours. And some of them even have a very, very low accessibility level because I live north of Amsterdam, where there is on the west the sea, on the east a big lake, and in the north there's basically nothing, so they're really dependent on Amsterdam itself. If you live in those same neighborhoods, 190 neighborhoods in the region, and you don't have a car, then your accessibility is even lower. And this is where you are, very low speeds. And interestingly enough, the speeds don't really matter. It doesn't matter so much where you live. Your public transport speed is very low, and only if you live in the city center itself, you actually get to many places, because there are many places to get to. Now, this still doesn't depict the transport problem, right? We just have a nice map of accessibility levels of population groups. So who has a transport problem? Well, remember, this was the principle of justice. Every person is entitled to sufficient accessibility. So a problem occurs when there's insufficient accessibility. And so this immediately introduces a very complex question here. What is sufficient accessibility? How do we determine this? And that is not a question academic can answer. It's basically a political question. We can provide empirical knowledge. We can show very low levels of accessibility actually lead to exclusion of people, but it will never be precise. So in the end, it will be a political decision. So let's just draw some lines and see how it works. So we can. Let's just go on. I took percentages of the average car accessibility in rush hour as a possible sufficiency line. And so that leads you to say everybody in that colored part of the diagram has insufficient accessibility, and those have a transport problem. And that would be then the transport problem we have to address. Now that would be then another interpretation of what is a transport problem. A transport problem occurs with insufficient accessibility, and our challenge is politically to define a threshold, which would be very, very difficult. Now I think this is a powerful message if we can ever get to this threshold. Now, it is maybe difficult, but on the other hand, we have such a threshold for income. And we have, if we talk about healthcare, every year we make very difficult decisions about which medicine will be insured and which won't be insured. So it's not we are not unique in transport of making these very difficult normative decisions. We just don't have a tradition of thinking normatively. We have to develop that. Still, I would say, even if you would take accessibility, it might not be the most desirable way to do, because this accessibility measurement tends to be quite rough. It tends to focus often just on travel time, and it ignores, for instance, cost. And there are many other dimensions of transport problems. You might not be wanting to travel because of fear or because it's too far walking to the bus, and we just assume that people can walk to the bus. There are many, many other reasons that just this rough accessibility measure can actually capture. Now we can develop accessibility measures to take them all into account, and then they become very, very complex, and they assume so many about people that we don't know it. So maybe there's another way of measuring transport problems, and that's just measuring them directly. Why do you make all this like strange stories, how we say in Israel? Because usually in Israel we do things this way, in a very difficult way, instead of going straight for the goal. Right, we have developed in the traditional perspective an enormous modeling system. We do travel behavior surveys, and we put it in a model. In the end, we know how much demand there is on a link, and then we know the transport problems. That's a weird, awkward way to define transport problems, isn't it? We didn't even ask people, so maybe we should just ask people. That was my idea. And I'm not the first. There are a few more studies around, but very, very few that actually ask people for the transport problems. They just ask travel behavior, and they never ask, do they have a problem? Wouldn't that be logical to do? So the idea was to have a very simple survey which you could easily administer among a large population. But the underlying idea, let me go back a step, is that transport problems probably vary in their severity, right? Some problems are minor. It wasn't very nice to get here, 40 minutes on the bus, 45, how much was it? In a traffic jam, the bus was pretty cold, I felt. Wasn't really much fun. Now that's what would be a small...
I was regaling you with stories.
And then we got these stories on top of everything. So I would say I was pretty much here. Anyway, that's one dimension of the transport problems that are there. And the other one is, of course, the frequency. So there were only a few on the bus, so few people suffered. I'm sorry, the wrong one. Frequency. So what we have done in the traditional way is actually focus on a transport problem that is extremely frequent, but it's not very severe, I think. And that's what we call travel time losses, right? You sit there in traffic, it's annoying, it's not nice, but you are there because it's the fastest way from A to B. Any alternative you could have taken would have taken you more time, would have been probably less comfortable, and often also more expensive even. So we focused on a very frequent problem which is not very severe. And then there is a body of academic literature, largely ignored by practitioners, and if they do address it, compliments to them, that's focused on very, very severe problems of transport poverty, which I assume, and we can be quite certain that their frequency is quite limited, is a small part of the population that suffers from it, but they suffer very, very hard and very deeply. Now there must be also people in the middle, right? People like me on this bus, somewhere. And so the question is how...
It's going to be very infrequent.
That's a good...
I'll make sure.
Thanks for that. And so the question is how frequent are these problems and how severe they are? And can we capture this? And can we see a graph like this? You know, would it look like this? Or is it jumping around? And of course, it's just an abstract thought. So I developed... what I call the Freedom of Mobility survey, and I call it Freedom of Mobility not because that's the proper name, but it sounds much better than measuring transport problems. And so freedom is positive, and mobility also is positive in a way that it talks about what you can do. And so there are three dimensions, I think, of transport problems you should try to capture. Which we try to capture there. One is satisfaction. You make trips, but how comfortable were those trips? The second is autonomy. To what extent actually are the trips you're making your decision, or are you dependent on others? Can you get out of the house of your own, or do you have to ask your parents to be driven somewhere? And it can be also your partner, or you have to bring your parents somewhere. And the third one is, to what extent actually you're free to do what you want to do. So did you decide to forgo trips? Did you make all the trips you wanted to do, or not? Now there's a fourth layer which actually was missing in the survey, which is the more severe one of transport poverty, where this one is, okay, I didn't go to my friends because it was really too much an effort, or there was no bus running back on time. That's the short-term effects. So the long-term effects maybe should also measure to what extent did you find a job because transport is so lousy to even get to jobs and think about jobs, for instance. We only focus on these three. So we had a very simple survey set up. The idea was to have an easy-to-administer thing that you could then roll out, in theory, easily over a population. We did a retrospective survey, so we asked people, look at the 3 days before the survey. Did you have transport problems in these 3 days? Assuming that 3 days you can still look backwards. For me it's already tough, but most people seem to be doing fine. And so we made very short and general questions, so just given 10 minutes still? Oh, very easy. 7, that sounds good. So we made simple questions. So one about trip difficulty. So this first question of satisfaction about the trips you actually made. So for instance, when you think of all the trips you made in the past 3 days, did you feel you were spending too much money on those trips? So it's a personal assessment whether you think you spend too much. Obviously you take into account your income, you take into account the trip, and what you got out of the trip. And so you could then answer for categories, no, never, for none of my trips, up to for almost all of my trips. We had another question about dependence on others. So we made a difference between being dependent on close family members, more distant people, and people you don't really are affiliated with. Assuming that the farther people are away and you're dependent on them implies a more stronger feeling of dependence. So for instance, the question is, over the last 3 days, how often did you have to rely on people in your household for your trips? And again, you can do this for none of your trips or for all of your trips. And so you get a feeling of to what extent you were actually free to do what you wanted to do without relying on others. There is a mistake here. So this is the third category, which is about actually foregoing trips. And so the question is, to what extent in the last 3 days did you forgo trips? For instance, because you couldn't come back. So you wanted to go to a party in the evening, but there was no bus back after 10 o'clock. So again, there's also time there. It took too much time to get there. It took too much money. It took me too much effort. So all these dimensions of travel that were taken into account in the questions. Very simple questions. I think there's much to improve here, but it's the idea that why do we do travel behavior survey? We should just measure directly transport problems and then we map them. And some results, what you would expect. If you don't have a car, you have more difficulties with your trip making actually. So the trips you're making, you do make them, but they're more, either you find them too expensive, they take too much time, or you find them actually quite taking lots of effort. Women and carless, again, are substantially more dependent on others than people who have a car or men. So this is also quite well known. Car access for men tends to be higher than for women, and so women also typically have lower driving license availability. So they become more dependent on others for trips when transit is not providing service or it's not in walkable distance. And another finding we found is that people on low income and young adults actually forgo quite a lot of number of trips. Also young adults, which was interesting to find, because the car access is not so good yet for young adults, and so their public transport, especially in the evening, is not good, and so they forgo lots of trips. So these are just a few first results of that survey, and we have much more work to do here. Now the future work is to develop the survey, then roll it out. And then there's some smart people who do good modeling to actually figure out where we can identify groups who have more problems than others and to what is it related to: car ownership, public transport quality, income levels, and to what extent are destinations close to your home, accessibility measurement, and so on. Still, the more fundamental question, I think that goes for all ways in which you mention transport problems, is if you have the problem, how do you move to policy making? So we have developed over the 60 years of the engineering perspective a very, very elegant way to analyze our transport system and to actually figure out what we have to do. Okay, we do travel surveys, we have some land use transport data which give us our future scenario, we run the model and we get links with insufficient demand. And it's a very, very elegant way. You know exactly what you have to do. You come to your job and say, I'm doing the trip assignment. So you start doing your trip assignment. Great, and then you throw it over the wall to the next guy who does route assignment. That's the same. Anyway, he throws it on the network, right? And we know pretty well what to do. And so it has a very clear cut and clear structure. Now, when we start measuring transport problems, getting to transport policy is not that obvious. We actually have to redefine the entire way we do transport policy preparation. It's not just about measuring something different, but it's about fundamentally rethinking how we move from understanding what's happening in the world to policy prescription. And I don't have the answer there yet, so I have still work to do. So let me conclude. So if you want to mobilize justice, I'm very happy this workshop is happening, and I wish it would happen in Israel or in Holland. I'm amazed and impressed by what's happening here in Toronto and in Canada, and I guess it's part of the people like Steve working on this topic that it's moving forward so fast here. So I should learn from you and have another chat on some bus somewhere. So anyway, if we want to do it, first of all, we should stop looking at a system. We should start thinking from people. All the time people, and it's very easy to forget. When I talk to people, it's very obvious to think even in transport modes. So I think mobilizing justice is about public transport. It's not about public transport, it's about thinking people. And how we solve the problems of people is a different matter. It might be public transport, it might be better bicycling, it might be even car ownership, it might be taxi vouchers. It can be many, many things. It is not about modes, it is not about the system, it's about thinking from people. Second, so we should stop measuring travel behavior. We can keep doing it, it's fine. But we should have at least the same number of people starting to analyze transport problems. One of these ways, and probably also just the direct way. Let's just build up a whole body of knowledge on how do we measure the transport problems directly, so we can actually pinpoint them and then try to understand them. And third, I think we should stop taking small problems that are very frequent as the most important and focus on problems that actually are very severe, even if they're not infrequent. So because we every day see people stuck in traffic, it doesn't mean this is the most severe problem. The most severe problem we don't see. These are people not getting out of their homes and not doing the things they want to do. We don't see them, we don't feel them, and even after 15 years of studying it, I don't understand, as a person who has these limitations, you cannot understand this, okay? So we have to be very, very careful in understanding that what we see and how we see the world is completely biased as highly mobile people without limitations, but actually the problems we're solving are those of people who live a very different life and have a very different experience. And if we don't realize it, we'll disappear again behind the background. So, thanks for this. If you don't have to do anything tonight or you can't fall asleep, I advise you this book also to my children. If they can't fall asleep, read my book. Thank you.
Karl has asked that we don't have time for questions. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to just, things got off to a bit of a later start. So we'll do 5 minutes of questions now, and then he's going to be here for 2 days, so.
And Saturday morning.
And so we'll have lots of time to chat with Karl. Any questions from the audience?
I was interested when you said, so there's
a microphone.
There was 3 things that you said were captured in the survey: the satisfaction, and then the autonomy and the freedom. So I was interested with the satisfaction that you highlighted the cost, asking people, was that the reason that they didn't travel, perhaps? Or what other things did you ask about with regards to experience of travel? Because I thought it would be more around comfort and that type of thing.
Yeah, it's the first trial, so I don't think it's a very good survey yet. So we have just 4 categories of difficulties. So one would be time. So you felt it took too much time to get to your destination. The second one was cost. The third was like physical effort. And the fourth was like capturing everything, comfort. How comfortable was it to get to your destination? Which might be anything. It might include fear. It might include other concerns you might have on traveling. I think there's much more work to do there and to refine that. Also, the way we asked about time led to the conclusion that people that own a car have terrible trip difficulties because it took them always too much time to get to places because they think they should get free-flowing traffic, like the engineers. You know, this dominant perspective is so dominant. So you have to ask it in a different way to actually understand to what extent time is a problem for people. Yeah, and there's more to do there, I'm sure. Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. It's also, I should maybe add, I use the word satisfaction here, but I'm not very happy with satisfaction in a way, because you can be very satisfied with a trip that is actually quite uncomfortable, but you just got used to it. And in philosophy, we call this the problem of the happy slave. So there's literature that a slave can be happy, but obviously it's an unacceptable situation to be in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karst. And I think that you probably already alluded to this. My question was going to be about limited horizons, that people normalize their experience.
Yeah. Yes.
So even if it's not a great experience, they internalize it and think this is just what it is, and may bias, the responses that you get in terms of, well, how free am I? Not a lot objectively, but maybe it's normal for me. So any thoughts on that?
Well, it was interesting to see, especially in the pilot service we did, that when we asked people if did they forgo trips, the first response would be no, not at all. And then after we did the questionnaire, we had a follow-up interview with them, and then they had started thinking about the questions. Actually, I did not go there. I didn't go there. So you see, indeed, this tendency to not see the problems so clearly. It's also a different way of looking at your own life, even, where you also have the tendency, of course, to avoid feeling frustrated, which is a very difficult feeling to be with all the time. So you prefer to ignore problems. So there are, I think, ways, if you talk about time, for instance, a different way of asking whether time is an issue is whether, do you think if you had available other means of transport that you could have gotten there more quickly? That could be a way of asking, actually identifying a transport problem in a different way. So taking also people out of the feeling like, I should be happy I get a bus at all, and that it arrives more or less on time, and that more or less it drops me where I have to be, which I would agree many people on low income are, seem to have that tendency to be happy with what they get, and that relates very much to a very fundamental issue in transport, where transport is not seen as an issue of justice, but of charity. So yes, we have public transport, but it's not based on principles of justice. It is basically, we keep the difference between charity and justice is, in justice you give the power to the people and you give them a right and they can claim that right. And when you use charity, you keep the power as the powerful, and you give when you want to give and you take when you want to take. And as long as that fundamental step is not taken of making transport a fundamental principle of justice, or a fundamental domain where justice should play a role, you will have that also, that behavior of not feeling not entitled to anything. Yeah.
So my question is that we have time?
No.
No.
Is it a yes or no question?
No.
So I'll just give a yes or no answer anyway.
That was the wrong one.
Let's hear the question without the answer. What's the question?
Well, I was going to follow up on the previous two, that you've written about the problems of directly asking people about their preferences because of what is called the expensive tastes problem.
Yeah, true.
And so are you adjusting for income or interpreting the results in a way that you can kind of discount expensive tastes? Yeah, I think you've alluded to it, but not directly in your comments so far.
Let's just say good question.
Good question. I think we should have many more smart people working on this, who can do a much better job in designing service than I can. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Karl.